Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vickie Lan, and in each episode, I and a guest will unpack a trope with an eye for world building, character development, or narrative structures. You can also join the conversation on TikTok and Instagram. For those times when the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Okay, Alisa, if you were asked to write a book from the perspective of someone you truly hated, like an arch nemesis, a childhood enemy, could you do it?
I think so. I have a sort of history of like when I was first dabbling in writing, of writing like these really horrible male characters. And I think it probably comes from reading like great literature, which is full of really horrible male characters. I would get into that.
Okay, all right. Is it easy for you to get into the perspective of someone that you hate? Like, can you see enough from their perspective to justify their actions through their point of view?
So I don't know if I would do a good job. So like, the quality of what came out, but I would enjoy it for a while in the sense that I often have to look harder for the good parts of my characters. They tend to be kind of grumpy or negative when I first write them, like I'm all on the negative side. So writing a villain or a nemesis would be fun and easy at first. They just
Ooh.
might not be very well rounded.
Okay, all right, that's fair enough. All right, that's fantastic. Alisa, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. So, the reason why we're here today to talk about this specific topic is we actually had a conversation, I feel like a month ago now, sometime in October, about your book, Smothermoss, at the Stacks Book Club event, which I thought went really, really well. And unfortunately, and I would have aired our interview, but unfortunately, I lost audio. So, for me, this is a great opportunity to kind of reconcile that lost interview and have a fresh conversation with you. So thanks so much for coming on. Um, can you please, before we get started though, can you please introduce yourself and tell our listeners about your latest project and this whirlwind author tour you've been going on?
Okay. I do regret that conversation we had at Stacks was lost to posterity. I feel like there's no way that we will reproduce just like the good flow we had that night.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm Alisa Alering, and I'm the author of Smothermoss, which is an Appalachian Gothic is my favorite way to describe it. And it's the story of two sisters, Sheila and Angie, who live on a remote mountainside in the 1980s. And they have a pretty difficult, hardscrabble life. And then when two women are murdered on the Appalachian Trail, really close to their home, it sets off this whole other level of chaos and danger in their lives. And so there's this murder, there's a mystery about who's done it and what's going to happen. There's also some magic, there's a whole lot of nature. And it's just a little bit haunted.
I really enjoyed listening to you present your book and talk about your book to our guests that particular evening. One thing that stood out to me, and I can't remember who asked it, but someone asked you why was it set in the 80s, and you talked about the remoteness of the 80s and the lack of technology that would have lent itself to a really spooky atmosphere in the Appalachian Mountains. Can you talk to that a little bit about how you set the tone for your book?
Yeah, sure. So I definitely do think that the story that takes place in Smothermoss in the 80s with the 80s setting wouldn't really be entirely as believable set in our current times because these two sisters are so isolated and they're so cut off, without, yes, they have a telephone in the house, but like they're not living this internet connected life. This is before um, regular people had access to even email or like the basic information of the web. And not only that, there weren't multiple perspectives, like because of their rural area, broadcast radio and television was really limited. Like they would get one station badly if they were lucky because of an antenna on top of their house. Or like maybe when they drove their car to town, they could pick up a second radio station. So like all the information that they had access to is really dominated by a central narrative that's controlled by someone else from somewhere else. And then there's, personal relationships in the gossip network and rumor and things like that. But there's just no way they can go verify anything or find out about things outside their experience.
Yeah, very true. And I remember watching horror movies in like the late 90s even and early 2000s before, smartphones were a thing, and how a lot of the storytelling is centered around that remoteness and the lack of resources because of the technology just wasn't there. And even the show Stranger Things, which takes place in the 80s, the opening episode where a little boy is trying to run away from a monster and he runs into his house and he just has the cord phone, and no other way of trying to get help. It's so scary and remote. So it brought back memories when I was a kid too, and being worried about not, if something were to happen, the power goes out, what do you do?
Right. So I think that there's just you're so much more cut off. If something goes wrong, you don't have access to calling for help at your fingertips.
hmm So, one thing that really stood out that I found to be really interesting in our conversation that I wanted to bring here today and create a whole episode around it was the idea of taking fragments of yourself and informing the characters that you create, especially if those characters are diametrically opposed. They're very different to each other, but you were able to still pull from different parts of yourself to inform these characters. So, let's set the stage a little bit. You have two main characters in your book, Sheila and Angie. Can you describe them for our listeners?
Okay, so Sheila is the oldest sister, and she's 17. Um, and she's sort of a very withdrawn person, maybe, that her way of coping with difficulty is to pull into herself, to make rules for herself to follow. She's the one who has a crush on another girl in her class, which is something that obviously at that time she feels she needs to hide from everyone. I think she even hides it from herself to a certain extent. Um, and her younger sister, Angie, she's 5 or 6 years younger, and she is irrepressible. She idolizes Rambo and other sort of 80s war movie heroes. She sort of goes all in on the physical. She runs wild in the woods, and she views herself as sort of like a militiaman in training. She thinks she's going to catch this killer, but she's a very instinctual creature. I think is one of the things that's very opposite of Sheila, because Angie also draws these sort of magical tarot cards, and she doesn't know why she draws them. She's just like, well, that's what Penn wanted to do, so that's what I've done, and she follows things without really questioning them. Whereas I think Sheila questions everything.
So I'll ask you the question I think you had the chance to answer before, which was which of the sisters do you identify with more?
So this is not even a difficult question for me. It's Sheila. And initially the book was, even though both sisters have always existed in my conception of this book from before page one, um, I always focused on Sheila. And it's actually true that over time and over working on the book, Angie grew to take up almost 50% and for it to be a nearly equal narrative. But initially, it was from Sheila's point of view. And Angie was seen only through Sheila's not very respectful point of view.
What informed that change, going from Sheila's character, which felt more parallel to your perspective, to diving deeper into Angie's, which is a very different perspective?
So, I mean, part of it was just that Angie, like from a craft perspective, in order to tell the story I wanted to tell, Angie had to have scenes where Sheila wasn't present, like where she got to do things. And so if it was all from Sheila's point of view, I couldn't have those scenes and those events. So then I have these scenes and even chapters that are all about Angie in her own private world. So to do that, I have to know what's going on with her. And to know what's going on with your character, then you start sympathizing with them. You're like, well, what would it be like to be like that? Like, why would she do that? Why would she behave that way? And so I got to know her better, sort of from her own perspective.
As you were crafting Angie, there's a lot of authenticity to both of your characters. But to reach that authenticity, what parts of you did you examine to flesh out Angie?
So that's a bit backwards, maybe in the sense that I don't think it was until I was finished that I realized with a certain amount of embarrassment that, oh God, Angie's me. two. That at first I was like, this is Sheila. I'm like, I get Sheila. I'm a list maker, a money saver, a very cautious person. So all of these traits that Sheila has, that's very uh, easy, very I like to be private, keep things to myself. And if I want something really badly, I'm even less likely to tell you about it. And that's very true for Sheila. And so Angie, I'm like, well, that's her diametric opposite. But then once the book is done, it just feels embarrassingly revealing to me that I've actually put this whole other side of myself into Angie without maybe the sort of military heroism. I don't know that that was ever a part of my fantasy world.
Isn't that awesome how therapeutic writing can be from a writer's perspective?
So I think that definitely was therapy because I was completely scarred by those 1980s nuclear apocalypse movies and just the whole idea of the Cold War and the fact that, like Russia versus the US and the bomb and all of that. Like that stuff was on television all the time. And like not something that like somebody who was 8 should have been watching, but I totally was. And so to that was one where like I got to take it back. I was like, well, what if you weren't afraid of that? Like, what if you bought into it? Like, what if you thought that was awesome? So that was a way of sort of relieving stress for my younger self, I guess, to give her that fearlessness.
Gotcha. Okay, so I've got some questions for you, and just a note to our listeners as well. I think the foundation in which we're looking at these questions is through authenticity. I think that as writers, we can definitely write all the different perspectives that we want to, and it could be more or less inauthentic. And we can write terrifying characters that completely counteract our personal values. But when we want to write authentically, many times it's how do you pull things from our own experiences, our own perspectives that kind of inform these decisions so that when readers read about these characters, it feels real. So, with that being said, and it doesn't have to be just Smothermoss. I know you're working on some other projects and you're kind of looking at characters in general. Have you ever noticed paradoxes that emerge between your characters, such as conflicting worldviews that reveal an internal conflict in yourself? Dualities on the paper coming from a duality in you.
So I don't know. I haven't thought too much about how both sides reflect myself, but I have written many stories, sort of to me, embarrassingly many, where I have these two usually female characters, and they're not necessarily sisters. Maybe they're like two best friends or something like that. And they represent these two opposite poles. I have a short story called The Wanderer King, and it's these two girls in this sort of like nearly apocalyptic landscape. Like there's been some kind of like social breakdown, and they come from two totally different like social classes or groups. So like they're on opposing sides, and they have to find their way through this broken world. But like they represent two different ways of dealing with this really stressful situation. I just remembered today I have a trunk novel about twin sisters who were thieves in this like secondary fantasy world. One of them is very beautiful, one of them is very plain. The beautiful one has no heart. And that turns out to be a good thing. So I see this recurring like twinning. I think there's something about the fascination of looking at your reflection in the mirror and like trying to see more than you can normally see. So like by putting two separate characters in, you can either work out personal issues or you can work out how you feel about a problem. I'm not really good at making decisions. So like coming down to yes or no. So I feel like I'm probably attracted to like working out both sides of an issue through these characters and then being like, you decide.
I love that. And I think you said that a couple times too in our interview at the event where you're like, that's up to the readers to decide, which I think is that's a great way of being able to like keep it vague and interpretive for the reader's perspective. I'm in a situation right now where I do think that in order to explore duality in characters through an authentic lens does require some self-awareness. I think that is really helpful. I wrote a book and it's on submission right now, and it's about an estranged relationship. And a lot of it was informed by my own experiences. I don't think I could have written that story as well as I did maybe 10 years ago. I wasn't in the mindset to be understanding of the other perspective, you know? And then I had life changes since then. I myself became a mother. I understood, you know, the impacts of all the different things. And suddenly I was able to explore that perspective in a way that ended up being very healing. So can you speak to a little bit about like the self-awareness that you kind of find yourself maybe having to examine as you unpack these characters and breathe life into them?
So I feel like I've used this word like 3 times already, but embarrassment's going to come up. I feel like I'm a person who is embarrassed in front of my own judgment. So
Okay.
like while I'll be writing something, I'll just be like, oh God, do you really like, do you really want to say that? Or because I know that I'm saying something that if people actually knew about me, I would be embarrassed about it.
Oh.
So maybe like going for the thing that's embarrassing is one of the secrets to authenticity. Like it's like I wouldn't want to say this out loud, but I could give it to my character.
Yes. I was gonna say, isn't that kind of freeing? It's like, okay, I'm gonna give the embarrassment to this other thing. Not me. It's not me.
Right.
It's the character.
And I do tend to write like certain slightly very traumatic social scenes for my characters. Not one that the details of which I have ever lived, but I'm just like, oh, that would be excruciating. Okay, let's do it.
How much do you think that you write from just kind of a gut impulsive, like right now, analyze it later? Or do you put a lot of thought before you start writing?
Oh, 100% right now, analyze it later.
Okay.
Like, I work really hard to not let my brain get involved until like at least the second draft.
Oh, I need to take advice from you. I'm thinking too much and I can't get this draft off the ground, but that's okay. Well, and something that was really impressive too was someone brought up about the sister dynamic, how we get the internal thought processes of Sheila and Angie, and but Sheila thinks more about Angie, whereas Angie doesn't seem to think at all about Sheila. And one of the interpretations that was brought up, I think it was me, I said, you know, as the oldest sister, that tracks, you know, like I was responsible for my youngest sibling, whereas I don't think my brother had to worry about me to the same degree I had. But that was something that I think you said you hadn't thought about or considered, but it just happened. And isn't that wonderful when the writing takes you in that direction and you have happy accidents like that?
Oh, for sure. It's like, well, you can be like, I meant to do that. Of course I did. But like it was one of the things where when the person in the audience asked the question, I was, gotta come up with a reason here. But when I thought about it, I was like, okay, this all totally makes sense. That, from my point of view, um, Sheila is slightly the main character. Like it's more her story than it is Angie's. So she gets a little bit more say. She gets to editorialize a little bit more. We get to hear more from her about her opinions about the other characters than Angie, who, even though she takes up half the space, doesn't have the same, like she's not in the driver's seat of the story, maybe. But it also works for their characters. It's true. It makes a lot of sense that Sheila, who not only is older, but also who feels responsible for everything, for
Mhm.
herself, for the family, for the economics, for, the rabbits, like everything.
Yeah.
And Angie, who feels responsible for nothing but her own dreams and wishes and wants. Of course, Angie wouldn't then think about Sheila and what Sheila wants and what Sheila's doing. She's not the sort of person who like contemplates and ponders and ruminates.
Hmm. From a writing craft perspective, was that an intentional decision from the very beginning to have that the more, what do you call it, omniscient POV for Sheila versus a little bit more, I don't know if that's even the right word, more into Sheila, less into Angie. Did your publisher have any input into that as well?
So the weighting towards Sheila, that just comes from the origin of the book and me thinking of it as Sheila's story and Angie as her little sister. But bringing Angie up to a larger part of the narrative where she carried a nearly equal weight, that actually came, I think, actually mostly from my agent at an earlier stage, where she's like, here we need to see a little bit more of Angie. And there are some specific scenes that were written in response to that, where Angie pursues the murder a bit more actively.
Mm. Oh, okay. For our listeners that are pursuing traditional publishing and are curious to know what the agent-author relationship looks like when revising a book, can you speak to that a little bit?
Oh gosh, I don't know if my experience is at all typical. I had a sort of circuitous route to agenting and then a smooth route to publication after that, which I think sometimes it's the other way around. But in this case, my agent was very helpful, and she had lots of, she was clear that she was in love with the manuscript and the voice and the characters and everything overall. But then, well, here's one thing, which is that my story started out into the misapprehension that it was a YA story. Teenage protagonist, some magic, seems like it fits in YA. And my agent wanted to sell it as an adult novel. So some of these changes were made with the idea of making sure that it was correctly tuned for an adult market rather than a YA market. And I think it was absolutely the right decision. I'm very happy that this is where it's ended up, and it seems to fit there really better than it would in YA. But you don't always know what you're doing
Mhm.
that's why you have an agent.
Yeah. Okay, so then how did the publisher, the editor relationship compare to the agent? So they went through the agent, made some changes, and then what does the publisher end up doing before it goes to print?
So I think in many cases, I know many authors who have really great working relationships with their editors. And my editor, Elizabeth DeMio at Tin House, is wonderful, but we didn't have a lot of changes. There were very slight alterations um, because the book had been polished so much before it got to them. We did a lot of copy editing and things like that. We adjusted some language here and there. I think the biggest thing there was, again, a little tuning for the adult market, which is that Bonnie, who is the girl's mother, who you don't really hear much about, but we gave her just a little bit more interiority as being one of the only adult characters who also matters.
Okay. I look forward to, if I get to that step, seeing what the difference is between a publisher and agent. I've had a fantastic agent who has held my hand and got me through a major rewrite last year. And so it is when for writers that are trying to get agents right now, they talk a lot about, the agent needs to love your book because they get really into it and they have to read it over and over and over and over again. It really does matter. And I found it to be very helpful when I was in the trenches. Okay, so this next question is, and maybe this relates or not to your experience, but how do you set boundaries between yourself and your characters, especially when they embody qualities or ideas you don't really agree with or feel comfortable expressing?
So maybe you'll tell me more what you mean by like setting a boundary between them.
I would say I think that there is confusion sometimes when readers or viewers of actors they kind of merge the two. You know what I mean? So I guess the question starts from when you write it to when you start promoting your books. I guess like how do you deal with that?
Yeah, okay. So I think in some ways that hasn't been much of a problem from the public perception
Okay.
side. And I'm guessing it's because the characters are teenagers and I'm very much not. So no one looks at me and thinks, oh, you're talking about yourself. Although if you line up the timeline, it's close enough that I could be talking about my childhood. Um, but I'm now the book that I'm working on right now features um, a female protagonist in her 40s, and I'm like, well, will people think that she's me, or I'm thinking, how much is she me? And I've really been working on some character development lately, and I got tracked back to some advice from Margot Livesey. It was in her book called, I think, Hidden Machinery, and I had written down some notes. And like she said something about building characters, and that she always puts a bit of herself in it. So some trait or something that she likes or some piece of history, but also something that is absolutely not like her. And
Mm.
so like the part that's like you helps you feel grounded and get started. It's like something you can identify with. But then something that's so clearly not like you, so like maybe I would say somebody who hates cats. That could
Mm.
never be me. But if you would give your character some trait like that, then you absolutely have to leave your own experience and exercise your imagination in order to explain. So, like, you get this thing where you're like, I can feel close to the character because this part's like me, but then you have to do the imaginative work if you give them something that's not like you.
Mm.
So I've been thinking a lot about that and about this new character and like, okay, I know she's like me, but I'm going to give her these things that are completely
Mhm.
not like me. And hopefully that means no one will get confused because they'll be like, oh, well, you were never in a punk band.
Do you think as a writer, writing about a character that's so different than you could inspire you to change? Can you influence yourself? So when you realized that Angie was you, did that kind of make you second guess and question yourself and lean into some of the traits that Angie had that maybe you weren't quite aware was you?
I don't know if it's made any concrete change in my current life. I feel like maybe it did help me be a little bit more like self-accepting of certain parts of myself. Because, we all have these, I believe we all have these definitions of ourselves of like, this is who I am, especially after you're like sort of past your 20s and you're sort of settled into an identity for yourself. Um, that I would be like, I maybe have disowned in my consciousness the parts of me that are Angie. And it's like, oh, I guess, yeah, okay, I am like her. Um, but I don't know that it makes me, so having done that, like having like reintegrated her, um, I don't know that it makes me braver on a day-to-day basis. I think the only thing that maybe is affected is like more the overall worldview, which is that I'm a terribly pessimistic person. Just like on a daily basis and just projecting into the future. And I try to make my books like not quite as miserable as I actually am.
Okay.
So like maybe they're a little bit more hopeful. And I know that's terrible because maybe Smothermoss isn't even the most hopeful book, but like there's
There
some
is hope
hope.
in there. Yeah.
And so like maybe I'm trying to convince myself.
But that's remarkable if you identify as a pessimist, but you write optimistically. That's cool. That's an interesting, the fragments of your personality kind of working themselves through different mediums.
Well, and I'm just trying to write a story that isn't necessarily what I believe, but what I would like to believe, I guess.
Okay. Okay. And I think that's beautiful. Okay. So then, uh, I guess okay, we talked about optimism, which is a wonderfully optimistic viewpoint. How do you stay authentic when you're creating flaws or biases in a character, especially when they may reflect some of your own qualities? So let's say you leaned into the pessimism. How do you keep the authenticity and honesty, I guess, with yourself? It's like a hard mirror to look at.
Right. I feel like I want to be like, well, I'll tell you when I finish the next book because I'm probably getting more into that.
You just write, you just don't think, right? Like we said earlier, you just get it out there and then you look back on it later and kind of analyze what you did because that helps.
that's that's true. And I try, it takes a while and it's sort of like an alchemical process. But when I'm writing, I try to get into a space where I have actually shut down my critical brain. Like this doesn't work every day and it doesn't always hold up for very long. But if I'm in that space, like if I've created that bubble with strong enough walls, then I tend to be able for that moment to write fairly honestly about some experience or perspective. So, like, think about the way someone who's writing a really honest memoir, like there's some real, like, uh, raw, telling it all kind of like memoir out there right now. And so, even though I'm fictionalizing, I'm still trying to tell things as clearly as that. And I say, I don't think I can't do it for long. Like something crumples and I'm not able to keep it up. But like in little dribs and drabs, and also you can go back and you can just be like, well, you were lying there. You were hiding. You were protecting. Like, try again. Write it better. Be more truthful.
Mm. So you catch yourself,
I
maybe.
think so. I mean, gosh, this is the combination of craft and like sensibility or honesty. I think that when I'm revising, if something isn't working, like if it clunks or it grinds and creaks, sometimes maybe 50% of the time, what's wrong is that it's not true.
Okay.
But it's not true. And I don't know how this is for other people, right? Like I don't know how other writers write because I know that uh, you know, I don't do things the way most people do, based on talking to other writers. So the
Oh.
fact that I'm like, well, the problem here is that it's not honest is maybe not where other people find their problems.
I think it's a very noble perspective, and it reflects the style of your writing, which I think it feels very true. I mean, first of all, it's very beautiful. It's very lyrical. I know that when you were reading your excerpt at the Stacks event, I know that people really appreciate it. It was very beautiful. Um, when you are starting your story, or brainstorming or outlining or whatever it is that you do in the initial first steps, what comes first for you? Is it the character, breaking down the character and the truthfulness of the character, or is it the plot?
Neither.
Oh, okay. Tell me more.
I write from image.
Okay.
And so like I see these sort of like stills in my mind of like a person in a setting, and they're not, it's like you pause um, the video. And in the case of Smothermoss, over time before I began, I generated a list of like 25 to 50 images. And they were, Sheila is here, or they're mushroom hunting, right? Like that became a theme, or they're waiting for the school bus, or Angie's in the tree. Like they were these different just images that I had. And then on a writing day, I would set my timer and pick one of those and write everything I knew. So this is back to the truth again. What do I know about what's going on? And tried to see like what happens if I press play on that image.
Wow. Okay. That explains the atmospheric feeling when you're reading. Are you doing that same approach for your current draft?
Yeah, it's a little bit more. Hmm. I'm trying to be more efficient, and that's probably a really dumb idea. Which means I'm trying to think about plot and structure at the same time as I'm doing this like image-based
Gotcha.
exploration.
Yeah.
I'm trying to like, get the other draft thinking in at the same time. And I say, I'm not sure that's a good idea.
Uh, I was about to ask, how's that working for you? Because I am also approaching my follow-up projects a little differently than I wrote this first book, and I'm struggling a little bit because I think I'm thinking too much. I know too much after going through the process. Do you find yourself in that similar situation now?
Uh, yes. I mean, I've got a whole bunch of new voices in my head now that I actually
Mm,
have a book out in the world and people have commented on it. And I'm like, oh, now I can imagine what they're going to say about the next book,
mm,
which is some new voices I wish I didn't have. But the other thing is I've been saying to myself, you can't think your way out of it because I know that I have spent time in previous projects before Smothermoss sort of staring at sticky notes on the wall or plot lines or whatever and trying to solve the book. And it's never, for me, it's never a good idea. And that's never where the solution comes.
mm.
And so I've been spending some uncomfortable days trying to think my way through like the things I don't know in a new book. And like, I should know better.
Ah,
That's not where I'm going to figure it out.
okay. Going back to your statement about finding the truth in these scenes, does could you, if I were to say, okay, write me a story about someone living on Mars,
Mhm.
how would you go about finding the truth in that scene?
I would go to two things. I would start with some research. I used to be a librarian. I used to be a science reporter. Like research and real grounding details are a great place to start. And I would need some of those things as sort of like, I would say tools in my toolbox, but really like props in my scene box because I need a setting. So like I need to have some sort of environment. But then the other thing is I would think about the context of this person, this story on Mars. I'm like, are they alone? Are they prepared to be there, or are they, like, are they somebody who doesn't belong there? Because then that's all the emotional heart of the story. It's like it doesn't really matter if it's on Mars or not. It's like what's
Mm,
their individual character context and how are they feeling about it?
I like that. Okay. Um, are there any particular stories or movies or shows that you're watching right now that you think has a really good job of finding truth in their characters? I'm springing this question on you a
Ooh,
little bit. I'm sorry, but
ooh, that's good. I don't even know what I think about like truth in other people's characters because like for me it's a compass by which I navigate telling a story.
okay.
And like I enjoy a character that feels believable, of
Hmm.
course, but I also enjoy comfort reads where the characters aren't terribly believable, but they're like very smooth and enjoyable.
Okay.
So like you don't always have to be truthful to write a compelling narrative, I don't
Mhm.
think. Um, mm, 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 mm.
I can give one example while you're thinking. One that I found to have. Okay, so when it comes to Marvel, I've seen examples of Marvel where like it's where they're phoning it in, right? And it feels a little bit like the entirety of Marvel's ridiculous, like and not ridiculous in a bad way. I love Marvel, but like, it's superheroes and things that aren't necessarily relatable. However, there are things about them that feel true, right? Like the need to want to improve the world around you, the frustration you may have with whatever kind of, threats are happening to the people around you. But I don't know if you've seen Agatha All Along on Disney Plus yet. Um, that this one, it's a comical, over the top, very theatrical kind of show. And it's funny. She's a funny character. Um, but towards the end, they start to reveal, and okay, spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. If you don't want to know the end of Agatha, fast forward. You find out that she's actually mourning the loss of a child. And so I've actually been through child loss. I've had 6 early miscarriages. And so one of the things, and I have 2 beautiful rainbow babies and everything is good now. But that is one of the things where if a story is going to explore child loss, um, I can feel whether or not it comes from like if it affects me and it was done like authentically versus just a story, that they're doing. And I thought it was really well done because it like through cinematic choices, now we're changing mediums, of course, but through cinematic choices, it showed the intimacy of a relationship between a mother and their son and the devastation when she lost him. And that was surprising to me. I was watching Agatha all along, just having fun with the supernatural comedy of it all. And then they just, bam, got you right in the face with the feels. And I was really appreciative of that. I don't think I'll rewatch that episode again, but I enjoyed it when I watched it the first time, and I was like, "Good job, Marvel. You did good."
So I think that that example like makes clear what you're talking about, and I know what you mean, and I feel like it's one of those things where when it's done lazily or it's gotten wrong, and it's some experience that you yourself have had and is I won't even say painful, but just strong for you. And if somebody uses that same, like the container of that same experience, but does it lazily, that feels really bad. And also that often happens, right? Things are used lazily all the time. So like when somebody gets it right and it feels like it hits the same way that you experienced it yourself, you're like, wow, like they actually,
Yeah.
they gave you respect, right, for
Yes.
your situation. Um, Wow, that's a good argument to not ever dial it in as a writer.
Yeah, I love it when that happens, and I feel like even WandaVision, which I'm sticking in the Marvel, it's just a fun. I like to use Marvel because it's so fantastical, right? It feels almost inauthentic, but they find ways to make it authentic. At the end of WandaVision, spoilers, it's ultimately about a woman who is mourning the loss of her lover, and so much that she fabricates a life with him that was never real, and she has to kind of accept the reality that he's not around anymore and move on with her life into loneliness loneliness, basically. And that I feel like is a truth that a lot of people can experience, different stages of their life. And so I do love that, and like that authenticity and pulling from experiences that you may have. I had an interview with another author where we talked about how do you put authenticity into scenarios that you may never have been in before, right? And I think what the example I did with him was some car issue. I forgot what it was, like driving a car off a cliff or something. I don't remember. But how do you put authenticity into that? How do you put truth into that when you haven't actually been in it? And I feel you spoke to it as well a little bit, pulling on the emotions that you are familiar with and informing your character's decisions. When you talked about Mars, you started asking really great questions like, were they supposed to be there? You know, like that's a really good, like, regardless of whether or not they're on Mars or not, like you said, there are great entry points to a character to insert some truth, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The car crash, I think it's the car over a cliff, even more than a car crash, is great because no one will actually, or like two people will actually be able to tell you that you were wrong.
Yeah.
That's something that if you've experienced it, you probably didn't survive. So we can all just imagine, and no one's going to be like, no, that's not how it was for me.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and that is a very interesting conversation that gets brought up now, especially with on book talk and social media, where the conversation includes the reader now, and they can make interpretations of your work, and they can say, I wouldn't have done it in that case. I know in situations of marginalized writers, a big conversation about 4 years ago was, when there wasn't a whole lot of marginalized books out yet, as a marginalized writer, I was scared because I was afraid that I put a flawed character out there and people would say, you're misrepresenting Vietnamese, Irish Americans. That's not what I would do, right? And so the argument you have is, well, that's what I did. And so you're inserting nuance and you're getting rid of the monolith mindset, but it is still scary because the reader can always say, I wouldn't do it if I was in that case, you know? So do you ever find yourself in a situation like that where the reader kind of disagrees with your choice?
I mean, fingers crossed, it hasn't happened yet. I've heard, for the most part, nice things from readers, although I tend to also try not to know, I guess. But people have been like, well, as like a young queer person in a rural area, like this really resonated. This really felt like how I felt. And some of the things as I was coming to understand myself, that like those things felt real to them, which is great. Um, but yes, like it is really hard. I heard what you were saying, because everybody's experience is going to be different. Like just
Hmm.
because one teenage girl feels this way about her crush on her classmate doesn't mean that the other three girls who are also secretly queer felt the same way about it, or even felt any way at all about it at that time.
Hmm.
And when you were talking about your discomfort with your own book and your project and like how you would defend it, it, it seems that would be limiting to have to defend it as being like, well, that's what I experienced. But like you could only rely upon your own experience instead of being able to imagine some other experience that was also valid. That like you
Hmm.
had to stick to the literal truth in order
Yeah.
to defend your position.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's tough. That's terrible.
And I think it's getting better. I think because I think that there's more complex points and arguments and perspectives. As more books are being published, you're seeing different interpretations of similar identities, and that helps a lot. I also come from a culture where there's a lot of comparison and perfectionism. And so part of me was worried that that was an expectation as well. If you're going to represent this and represent this dynamic, then it better be the perfect thing that we all compare each other against. And that's not fair, right? There's lots of people that don't like comparison is a thief of joy. And so there's bravery to being truthful too. Um, but I think that's also the joy of having that conversation now these days with readers. You have the ability to present a case. A reader can respond the way that they want, and all perspectives are out there. It's like yeah, you wrote yours at least, and it's there.
Yeah. I mean, I think the danger there is if maybe you're already involved in those spaces before or while you're writing, then it's can be internalized intimidation, right? That you
Hmm.
might censor yourself or mm, turn your narrative in a certain way because, like me imagining future reviews, you're imagining these future reader responses, and you're
Hmm.
imagining the person who can be like very funny, but also very kind of cruel about what they say, and imagining those kinds of responses. And then maybe you're like, well, maybe I shouldn't write that. It's like,
Yeah.
does it become a form of self-censorship?
Oh gosh, it's so true. You're right. And yes, so it's about as a writer, how do you steel yourself, put the barrier up, because you can't control but everybody thinks of you, and they will think of anything to think of you, right? So how do you continue to be truthful? What do you do? How do you do that?
Hmm. So one of the things, I think this goes back to writers like way long ago before there were so many more opportunities to interact with readers, is that people who wrote memoirs or even who wrote sort of thinly disguised autobiographical fiction, they were always worried about what the other participants in the story. So like if you wrote about your family, like would your sister say, that's a really mean way to like think about me. Like, and you're like, well, but Angie's not you. And she'd be like, oh, come on. Like, she's totally me. And like, I wasn't that ugly. I wasn't that rude. I wasn't, you know. So like anytime you reveal something or tell something that anybody else thinks that they know what's going on better than you, like they would argue with you. So what is it that you're writing for?
Mm,
And I'm not saying this is easy because like I find it really difficult, but like are you writing to write a best-selling book, right? And is that your main goal? And what things matter to you along the way? Are you writing because you're trying to satisfy some internal drive? And
mm.
then what things are you willing to put up with in order to satisfy that thing you want to say? I mean, some people are willing to put up with an awful lot of abuse, way more than I would be, because they have something they really feel like they need to get off their chest. And I sort of admire that in some way.
I do too. All right. Well, my gosh, I thought this was a really great conversation. I think we did it again. We had a good conversation the first time, and I feel like we did it again. So thank you so much. Alisa, can you share with our listeners how they can find you if they want to read your book, follow you on social media?
Sure. I mean, my book is hopefully available everywhere. It's on Amazon. It's at Barnes and Noble. It should be at your local indie bookstore. Indie bookstores have been very supportive, so like I would suggest starting there. Also, there's an audiobook with
Mm.
Susan Bennett is the narrator, and she's done a really good job. So if you would prefer to listen rather than read, I think it's maybe only like 7 hours. It's not like a huge ordeal. Take a couple of walks and do your dishes and get a Smothermoss that way. My website, alering.com, and I'm mostly active on Instagram under my name.
Awesome. And do you have any final words about putting yourself into books, fragmenting fragments of the author that we didn't cover?
Well, in case there are writers listening, I'm going to actually leave you with a writing exercise in a way, which it came up to me when we were talking about truth and authenticity. I teach whole novel workshops through the Highlights Foundation. So I work every year with a number of people who are sometimes writing their first novel, and I have to encourage them to dig deeper. And this exercise came from my friend and fellow author, Ashley Hope Perez. But what it is you look at some scene and you say, yes, but what does my character really want? And you write the answer to that. And then you say, no, what do they really, really want? And you write the answer to that. And then, but that's not it. What do they really, really, really want? And you keep digging. You don't take that first answer. Um, and this often really provides results that you find out not what the character says they want and not what they think that they want, but what they actually truly want. And I think it's great for uncovering the truth.
Wow. Okay, that's a great exercise. All right, writers out there, make sure you follow this exercise, and I'm sure it'll open up new worlds and possibilities for their story. Alisa, thank you again so much for joining me today. I'm glad that we got to have this chat. I hope you have a wonderful week. Listeners, thanks for tuning in, and there'll be another one next week. I'll talk to you later. Bye.